Case 1. Summer Rust, the mother who chose murder over motherhood. On a sweltering August night in 2011, in the quiet rural expanse of Grady County, Oklahoma, 3-year-old Tegan Rust took her last breath. But this wasn't a tragic accident or a sudden illness. This was calculated murder, and the killer was the one person who should have loved her unconditionally, her own mother, Summer Rust. Summer Pascal, as she was known before marriage, seemed like an ordinary young woman living in small-town Oklahoma. She had married, had a daughter, and from the outside, appeared to be building a normal life. But beneath that facade lurked something dark, something broken that would eventually manifest in the most horrific way imaginable. The evening of August 13, 2011, started like any other in the Rust household. Neighbors would later report nothing unusual, no screaming, no sounds of struggle, just an eerie, unsettling silence that would soon be shattered by an unthinkable discovery. Summer Rust, alone with her daughter Tegan, made a decision that would forever brand her as one of Oklahoma's most evil mothers. What exactly happened in those final moments? According to court documents and testimonies that emerged during the investigation and subsequent trial, Summer deliberately took her daughter's life. The details are almost too gruesome to recount, but they're essential to understanding the depths of depravity we're dealing with here. Summer suffocated little Tegan, holding her down as the child struggled for air, fighting against the very person who had brought her into this world. Imagine the terror that 3-year-old must have felt. At that age, children see their mothers as their entire universe, their protector, their safe harbor in every storm. Tegan would have looked into her mother's eyes expecting comfort, expecting love, and instead found only cold determination to end her life. The psychological horror of those final moments is something that haunts everyone who worked on this case. After killing Tegan, Summer didn't immediately call for help. She didn't break down in remorse or panic. Instead, according to investigators, she attempted to stage the scene, trying to make it appear as though the death was accidental or the result of some other cause. This calculated attempt at deception reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of Summer's personality, the premeditation and cold rationality that accompanied her murderous actions. When emergency responders finally arrived at the Rust home, they found Tegan's small body lifeless. The paramedics, seasoned professionals who had seen their share of tragedy, were nonetheless shaken by what they encountered. Something about the scene didn't sit right with them. The positioning of the body, Summer's demeanor, the lack of logical explanation for how a healthy 3-year-old could suddenly die, all of it raised immediate red flags. The investigation that followed was meticulous and heart-wrenching. Detectives from the Grady County Sheriff's Office worked around the clock, piecing together the timeline of that terrible night. They interviewed neighbors, family members, and anyone who had contact with Summer and Tegan in the days leading up to the murder. What emerged was a portrait of a mother who was increasingly disconnected from her child, emotionally distant, and possibly suffering from psychological issues that she refused to address or acknowledge. Medical examiners conducted a thorough autopsy on Tegan's tiny body. The findings were conclusive and damning. This was no accident, no sudden illness, no tragic mishap. This was homicide, plain and simple. The evidence of asphyxiation was clear, and the manner of death pointed unmistakably to maternal filicide, the murder of a child by their mother. As the evidence mounted, Summer's story began to unravel. Her initial claims of innocence grew weaker with each piece of forensic evidence presented. Investigators noticed inconsistencies in her timeline, contradictions in her statements, and a disturbing lack of emotional response that one would expect from a mother who had just lost her child. Where were the tears? Where was the anguish? Instead, there was a cold, almost calculating composure that chilled everyone in the investigation. The prosecutors built an airtight case. They presented the forensic evidence, the medical examiner's findings, the inconsistencies in Summer's statements, and the testimony of experts who could speak to the impossibility of Tegan's death being accidental given the physical evidence. The picture they painted was of a mother who, for reasons that may never be fully understood, decided her daughter's life was expendable. During the trial, which took place in 2014, the courtroom was packed. Community members who had watched this case unfold wanted to see justice served for little Tegan. Summer's defense team tried various strategies, They suggested mental health issues. They questioned the evidence. They attempted to create reasonable doubt. But the prosecution's case was simply too strong, too comprehensive, too damning. Witnesses testified about Summer's behavior in the days and weeks before Tegan's death. Some described a mother who seemed disconnected, who showed little affection toward her daughter, who seemed burdened rather than blessed by motherhood. Others spoke of concerning statements Summer had made, hints that she felt trapped by her responsibilities, suggestions that she wished for a different life, one without the constraints of a young child. The jury heard all of this, saw all the evidence, and considered the full weight of what Summer Rust had done. When they retired to deliberate, the outcome seemed almost predetermined. After careful consideration of all the facts presented, they returned with a verdict that surprised no one: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase brought its own emotional weight. Tegan's father, devastated by the loss of his daughter and the betrayal of his wife, gave a victim impact statement that left hardly a dry eye in the courtroom. He spoke of Tegan's laughter, her innocence, her bright future that had been stolen by the person who should have protected her most fiercely. He described the unbearable pain of knowing that his daughter's last moments were filled with fear and confusion, betrayed by her own mother. The judge, showing no mercy for a crime that deserved none, sentenced Summer Rust to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This meant that Summer, still a relatively young woman, would spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. She would never again feel the sunshine on her face as a free woman. She would never celebrate another holiday with family. She would grow old and die in prison, exactly as she deserved. Summer's case raises troubling questions that continue to haunt criminologists and psychologists. What drives a mother to kill her own child? Was it postpartum psychosis that went untreated? Was it a personality disorder that made her incapable of normal maternal bonding? Was it simply evil in its purest form? The truth is, even with all our modern understanding of psychology and criminal behavior, cases like Summer's remain deeply mysterious. Maternal filicide is, statistically speaking, rare. Most mothers would sooner die themselves than harm their children. The maternal bond is one of the strongest in nature, rooted in biology, reinforced by hormones, and strengthened by the daily acts of caregiving. To override that bond requires something profoundly broken in the psyche. Summer Rust represents that brokenness in its most extreme and tragic form. Today, Summer Rust remains incarcerated in an Oklahoma state prison. She will never be released. She will never have the opportunity to rebuild her life, to have more children, to experience freedom again. And while some might argue that life in prison is too lenient for someone who murdered their own child, others see it as a punishment worse than death. Decades upon decades to reflect on what she's done, to live with the knowledge that she murdered an innocent child who trusted her completely. Tegan Rust's life was cut brutally short at just 3 years old. She never got to go to kindergarten, never got to make friends, never got to experience first love or heartbreak, never got to grow up and become whoever she might have been. All of that potential, all of that beautiful future, was extinguished by her mother's hands. That is the true tragedy of this case, and it's why Summer Rust earned her place on this list of Oklahoma's most evil mothers. Case 2. Toni Ingram, the Starvation Chamber of Horrors. In 2012, in what should have been a quiet suburban neighborhood in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, investigators walked into a house that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. What they found inside wasn't just evidence of neglect or even typical child abuse. What they discovered was a chamber of horrors where a 9-year-old adopted boy had been systematically starved to death by the woman who was supposed to be his mother, Toni Ingram. The boy, whose name has been withheld to protect his privacy even in death, weighed just 31 pounds when he died. To put that in perspective, a healthy 9-year-old boy should weigh between 60 and 90 pounds depending on height and build. This child weighed barely more than a toddler. He had been starved so severely that his body had begun consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy said it was one of the worst cases of malnutrition he had ever seen in his 30-year career. How does this happen? How does a child waste away to nothing in a modern American home without anyone noticing or intervening? The answer lies in the calculated cruelty of Toni Ingram and the isolation in which she kept her victim. Toni and her husband had adopted the boy when he was younger, supposedly to give him a better life than he'd had in the foster care system. Adoption should be a beautiful thing, a chance for a child without a family to find love, stability, and belonging. But for this little boy, adoption became a death sentence delivered slowly, painfully, over months and possibly years of deliberate starvation. According to the investigation and court testimony, Toni Ingram treated this adopted son drastically differently from her biological children. While her own kids ate regular meals and maintained healthy weights, the adopted boy was denied food as punishment for perceived misbehaviors. He was locked in his room for extended periods. He was excluded from family meals. He was treated not as a cherished son, but as an unwanted burden, and eventually, as something less than human. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they occasionally saw the boy, but he was always quiet, withdrawn, and noticeably small for his age. Some expressed concern but didn't know who to call or what to say. Others simply assumed he was naturally petite or had a medical condition. The tragic reality is that warning signs were there, but our society's reluctance to interfere in family matters, even when a child's life hangs in the balance, meant that those signs were ignored until it was too late. The systematic nature of the starvation is what makes Toni's crime particularly heinous. This wasn't a moment of rage or a single violent act. This was abuse sustained over a long period, requiring daily decisions to withhold food, to ignore the child's hunger, to watch him waste away and do nothing to help. Each day that Toni Ingram woke up and decided not to feed that boy was another day she chose his suffering over his welfare. Court documents revealed that Toni would prepare meals for the rest of the family while the adopted boy was locked away, sometimes able to smell the food but unable to access it. Imagine the psychological torture of that, being a hungry child, locked in a room, smelling dinner cooking, hearing your siblings eating and laughing, knowing that you are deliberately being excluded and starved. The cruelty is almost incomprehensible. When the boy finally died, Toni initially tried to claim it was unexpected, that he had been sick, and she didn't realize how serious it was. But the medical evidence told a very different story. This child didn't die of an illness. He died of starvation, pure and simple. His organs had begun shutting down from malnutrition. He had pressure sores from lying in bed, too weak to move. His hair was falling out. His bones were visible through his skin. There was no way to mistake this for natural illness. The investigation expanded to examine why Child Protective Services hadn't intervened. The boy had been in the school system, though Toni had withdrawn him at some point, claiming she would homeschool him, a common tactic used by abusive parents to isolate their victims from mandatory reporters like teachers. Once isolated at home, the boy had no advocates, no one checking on his welfare, no escape from the woman who was slowly killing him. Toni's husband was also investigated, and questions arose about his culpability. How could he not have known? How could he have allowed this to happen? While some evidence suggested he may have been complicit or at least willfully blind to the abuse, the prosecution focused primarily on Toni as the primary perpetrator. She was the one who controlled the household, who made decisions about the children's care, and who actively orchestrated the starvation. During the trial, prosecutors presented heartbreaking evidence. Photographs of the boy before the adoption showed a normal, healthy-looking child with a shy smile. Photographs taken during the investigation showed a skeletal figure that looked like something from a concentration camp, not a suburban American home. The transformation was shocking, disturbing, and undeniable. Expert witnesses testified about the timeline of starvation, explaining how long it would take for a child to reach that level of emaciation. Their testimony made clear that this abuse had been ongoing for many months, possibly over a year. Every single day of that time period, Toni Ingram had the opportunity to stop, to feed the child, to seek help, to show even a modicum of maternal compassion. She chose not to. The defense attempted to argue that Toni had mental health issues, that she was overwhelmed, that she didn't understand the severity of the situation. But the prosecution demolished these arguments by pointing out that she managed to feed and care for her biological children just fine. She was capable of appropriate parenting. She simply chose not to extend that care to her adopted son. This selectivity proved that her actions were deliberate and motivated by something darker than mere neglect. The jury was visibly affected by the evidence. Several jurors were seen wiping away tears as photographs of the deceased boy were shown. Others looked at Toni with expressions of disgust and disbelief. How could a mother do this? How could anyone do this? These questions hung heavy in the courtroom air. When the verdict came back, guilty, there was a collective exhale in the courtroom. Justice, at least in the legal sense, would be served. During sentencing, the judge didn't mince words. He called Toni's actions depraved, inhuman, and unforgivable. He noted that the boy had been entirely dependent on her for survival, and that she had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. He sentenced her to life in prison, ensuring she would never have the opportunity to harm another child. Toni Ingram's case shines a harsh light on failures in the adoption and child welfare systems. How was she approved as an adoptive parent? Were there warning signs during the home study process? Why wasn't there more follow-up after the adoption was finalized? These systemic questions remain partially unanswered, but they've led to some reforms in how adoptions are monitored in Oklahoma and beyond. Today, Toni Ingram sits in an Oklahoma prison where she will remain for the rest of her life. She receives 3 meals a day, an irony not lost on those familiar with her case. She has access to food, water, and basic health care, all things she denied to her adopted son. Some might see this as unjust, but the law prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, even for someone whose crimes were as cruel as hers. The boy she starved to death never got to grow up. He never got to experience the normal joys of childhood: birthday parties, school field trips, friendships, family vacations. He spent his final months in agony, his body slowly consuming itself, crying out for food that never came. That is Toni Ingram's legacy, and it's why she has earned her place among Oklahoma's most evil mothers. Case 3. Alysia Adams, the caretaker who became a killer. In January of 2023, the small town of Cyril, Oklahoma, population barely 800, became the center of a national news story that would break hearts across the country. 4-year-old Athena Brownfield had disappeared, and the massive search that followed would eventually lead to a discovery so horrific it defied comprehension. The little girl hadn't been kidnapped by a stranger or lost in an accident. She had been murdered and buried in the backyard by the woman who was supposed to be caring for her, Alysia Adams. Athena's story began in tragedy and ended in even greater tragedy. She and her sister had been placed in the care of Alysia Adams and her husband, relatives who had taken on responsibility for the girls. This was supposed to be a safe arrangement, a family solution that would keep the children out of the foster care system and in the care of people who knew and presumably loved them. Instead, it became Athena's death sentence. On January 10, 2023, a postal worker in Cyril noticed something unusual. Athena's 5-year-old sister was wandering alone near the Adams home, looking distressed and confused. When authorities were called and began asking questions, the sister made statements that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard them. She said Athena had been missing, that Alysia had done something bad, that her little sister was hurt. The details were unclear. The girl was only 5 and traumatized, but it was enough to launch an immediate investigation. Law enforcement descended on the small town. The FBI got involved, as they typically do in cases of missing children. An Amber Alert was issued. Volunteers organized search parties. Everyone hoped that Athena would be found alive, maybe hiding somewhere, scared but safe. But as the hours ticked by without any sign of the little girl, that hope began to fade. Alysia Adams's behavior during the initial investigation raised immediate red flags. She was evasive, her story kept changing, and she showed a disturbing lack of concern for Athena's whereabouts. When investigators pressed her about what had happened to Athena, Alicia's answers were vague and inconsistent. She claimed ignorance about where the girl might be, but her body language and demeanor suggested otherwise. The husband, Yvonne Adams, was also brought in for questioning. His interview with law enforcement would prove crucial to the case. According to reports, Yvonne eventually admitted that Athena had died and that her body had been buried. He directed investigators to a location near a neighbor's property, and there, hidden beneath Oklahoma soil, they found what they had been dreading: the body of 4-year-old Athena Brownfield. The autopsy results were devastating. Athena had died from injuries consistent with physical abuse. This wasn't an accident or a tragic mishap. This was a homicide, the result of violence inflicted on a defenseless child. The medical examiner's findings pointed to blunt force trauma, suggesting that Athena had been beaten, possibly repeatedly, in the time leading up to her death. As investigators pieced together what had happened, a horrifying narrative emerged. According to the evidence and witness statements, Alysia Adams had been physically abusing Athena, possibly for some time before her death. The abuse may have been punishment for behaviors Alysia deemed unacceptable, or it may have been motivated by anger and frustration. Whatever the reason, it culminated in violence severe enough to kill a 4-year-old child. After Athena died, rather than seeking help or coming clean about what had happened, Alysia and her husband made the conscious decision to bury the body and hide the evidence. They dug a grave on property near their home and placed Athena's small body in the ground, covering up their crime both literally and figuratively. Then they continued with life as if nothing had happened, at least until Athena's sister's statements to the postal worker brought everything crashing down. The community of Cyril was devastated. In a town of 800 people, everyone knows everyone. Many residents had seen Athena around town, had waved to her, had perhaps even spoken with her. Now they learned that this sweet little girl had been suffering abuse in their midst, and they hadn't known. Vigils were held. Teddy bears and flowers accumulated at makeshift memorials. People wept openly for a child most had never met, but whose story touched them deeply. Alysia Adams was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The charges carried the possibility of the death penalty, which prosecutors indicated they would seek given the heinous nature of the crime. In Oklahoma, the murder of a child during the commission of child abuse is considered a particularly aggravating circumstance, making the case death penalty eligible. The legal proceedings have been ongoing, with Alysia maintaining her not guilty plea despite the overwhelming evidence against her. Her defense team faces an uphill battle. The physical evidence, the testimony of her husband, the medical examiner's findings, and the statements of Athena's sister all point unmistakably to Alicia's guilt. Yet she persists in denying responsibility, perhaps hoping for some legal technicality, or perhaps simply unable to face the enormity of what she's done. Athena's biological parents, who had lost custody of their children due to their own issues, now face the unbearable reality that their daughter is dead, killed by people who were supposed to keep her safe. Whatever mistakes they made as parents pale in comparison to the ultimate failure of the system and the Adams family to protect Athena from harm. They will live with the knowledge that their little girl died scared, in pain, and calling for help that never came. The case has prompted serious questions about how children in informal care arrangements are monitored. Athena and her sister were not in official state custody. They were in kinship care, living with relatives. This meant there was less oversight than there would have been if they'd been in foster care with strangers. The assumption is that family will naturally care better for children than non-relatives. But Athena's case proves tragically that biology and family ties are no guarantee of safety. Oklahoma's Department of Human Services has faced scrutiny over whether they did enough to ensure the girl's well-being. Were there warning signs that were missed? Were there reports of abuse that weren't followed up on? Could Athena's death have been prevented with better monitoring and intervention? These are painful questions that officials are still grappling with. As of the time of this documentary, Alysia Adams is awaiting trial. If convicted, she faces either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Given the severity of the crime and the age of the victim, it's likely that prosecutors will push for the harshest possible sentence. Whether Alysia will spend the rest of her life in prison or face execution remains to be seen, but one thing is certain, she will never again walk free. Athena Brownfield was only 4 years old when her life was violently ended. She loved playing, she loved her sister, and she deserved to grow up safe and loved. Instead, she suffered abuse at the hands of her caretaker and died alone and afraid. Her body was hidden in the ground like trash, as if her life meant nothing. That casual disregard for a child's life is what makes Alysia Adams one of Oklahoma's most evil mothers, and why her name deserves to be remembered alongside her victims, so that Athena is never forgotten. Case 4. Brenda Andrew, the Black Widow of Oklahoma City. On a cold November night in 2001, Rob Andrew returned to his Oklahoma City home after a long day at work. He was an insurance agent, a father of 2, and a man in the middle of a difficult divorce. As he pulled into his driveway and walked toward his front door, He had no idea that the next few moments would be his last. Waiting in the shadows were two figures with murder on their minds, and one of them was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Brenda Andrew. Brenda Andrew's story is one of greed, lust, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder. It's a story that would earn her the distinction of being the only woman currently on Oklahoma's death row, a place she has occupied for over 2 decades and will likely remain until she takes her last breath. Brenda and Rob Andrew had been married for years and had built what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class life. They had 2 children together, lived in a nice house, and were active in their church community. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect American family. But beneath that wholesome exterior, Brenda was living a double life that would eventually lead to murder. Brenda had been having an affair with a man named James Pavitt, a handyman who did work around the Andrew home. The affair wasn't just physical. Brenda and James had fallen deeply into an obsessive relationship that consumed them both. They spent hours on the phone, exchanged passionate letters, and began planning a future together. There was just one problem. Brenda was still married to Rob, and a divorce would mean splitting assets and losing the comfortable lifestyle she'd become accustomed to. Rather than accept a divorce settlement or work out a reasonable arrangement, Brenda decided on a more permanent solution. She and James began plotting to murder Rob, motivated by a mixture of greed and the desire to be together without complications. They wanted Rob's life insurance money, they wanted the house, and they wanted each other. Murder seemed, in their twisted logic, like the perfect solution. The planning was meticulous. Brenda increased Rob's life insurance policy in the months before the murder, making sure she would be the beneficiary. She and James discussed various methods, how to do it, when to do it, how to avoid getting caught. They eventually settled on a plan that involved ambushing Rob at his own home. On November 20th, 2001, that plan was put into action. As Rob approached his front door, James Pavitt emerged from hiding and opened fire. Rob was shot multiple times with a shotgun at close range. The attack was brutal and overwhelming. Rob didn't have a chance to defend himself, to run, or even to comprehend what was happening. He was cut down in his own driveway, bleeding out on the concrete while his murderers fled the scene. Brenda had made sure she had an alibi. She was out with the children when the murder occurred, establishing herself as being nowhere near the scene. When she received the call about Rob's death, she rushed to the scene, playing the role of shocked and grieving widow. She cried. She acted distraught. She told police she couldn't imagine who would do such a thing. It was an Academy Award-worthy performance, except that investigators weren't buying it. From the very beginning, Brenda was a suspect. The circumstances were too convenient. A contentious divorce, a recent increase in life insurance, and a wife who had a boyfriend waiting in the wings. Detectives began digging into Brenda's life, and what they found was damning. Phone records showed constant communication between Brenda and James Pavitt. Witnesses came forward to testify about the affair. Financial records revealed Brenda's interest in Rob's insurance money. And perhaps most damning of all, physical evidence placed James Pavitt at the scene of the murder. As the investigation closed in, both Brenda and James were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Prosecutors could show motive, opportunity, and means. They could demonstrate the affair, the planning, and the execution of the murder plot. They had witnesses, forensic evidence, and the defendant's own incriminating statements. The trials were sensational, attracting media attention from across the state and nation. Here was a case that had everything: sex, money, murder, and betrayal. Brenda Andrew, with her composed demeanor and protestations of innocence, became a figure of public fascination and revulsion. How could a mother, a churchgoer, a seemingly normal suburban woman, plot and execute the murder of her children's father? The prosecution painted Brenda as a manipulative black widow who orchestrated her husband's murder for financial gain and to pursue her affair with James Pavitt. They presented her not as a victim of circumstance or passion, but as a calculated killer who was willing to destroy her family for money and lust. Witness after witness testified to her affair, her discussions about Rob's insurance, and her demeanor after the murder. James Pavitt was tried separately and also convicted of first-degree murder. He received a death sentence as well, though his execution has also been delayed by the ongoing legal proceedings and moratoriums on executions in Oklahoma. Both he and Brenda have spent decades on death row, separated by prison walls, but forever linked by the terrible crime they committed together. Brenda's defense team tried various strategies. They attempted to portray her as a woman trapped in an abusive marriage, though evidence of Rob's alleged abuse was thin and disputed. They suggested that James Pavitt was the real mastermind and that Brenda was manipulated into going along with the plan. They questioned the forensic evidence and the reliability of witnesses, but none of it was enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. When the guilty verdict came down, Brenda showed little emotion. When the sentence was announced, death by lethal injection, she remained stoic. Perhaps she was in shock, perhaps she was in denial, or perhaps she simply couldn't process the reality of what her choices had cost her. She would never again be free. She would never watch her children grow up from anywhere but behind prison walls. She would die in state custody whenever Oklahoma finally resumed executions. The impact on Brenda and Rob's children cannot be overstated. They lost their father to murder and their mother to prison. They grew up knowing that their mother had orchestrated their father's death, that she had valued money and her lover more than her own family. The psychological damage of such knowledge is immeasurable. These children became orphans not through tragedy or accident, but through their mother's deliberate choice. Brenda Andrew has now spent over 20 years on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma. She is the only woman among the state's death row inmates, a dubious distinction that underscores both the rarity and the severity of her crime. She has exhausted most of her appeals, though her execution date remains uncertain due to Oklahoma's complicated history with the death penalty and ongoing legal challenges. Life on death row is isolating and monotonous. Brenda spends 23 hours a day in her cell, with limited human contact and minimal privileges. She has access to books, limited television, and occasional visits. But her world has shrunk to a tiny cell and the knowledge that someday, the state intends to execute her for her crimes. Some might argue this prolonged wait is cruel, while others see it as fitting justice. Let her think about what she's done. Let her imagine Rob's final moments. Let her understand the full weight of her choices. The question that haunts Brenda Andrews' case is the same that haunts many cases of maternal crime. How could a mother do this? How could someone who gave birth to children, who presumably loved them at some point, destroy their family in such a catastrophic way? The answer may lie in a combination of greed, selfishness, and a fundamental moral bankruptcy that allowed her to value her own desires above everything and everyone else. Brenda Andrew will likely never leave death row alive. Whether she is eventually executed or dies of natural causes in prison, she will never again know freedom. She will never attend her children's weddings, never meet her grandchildren, never experience the simple pleasures of life outside prison walls. And while some might pity her fate, it's important to remember that Rob Andrew never got to experience any of those things either, because Brenda took them from him in the most violent and permanent way possible. Her case stands as a dark reminder that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. It can wear a pleasant face, attend church on Sundays, and live in a nice suburban house. But beneath that normalcy can lurk a capacity for violence and betrayal that shocks the conscience. Brenda Andrew is, and will forever remain, Oklahoma's Black Widow, a mother who chose murder over morality, and who will pay for that choice for the rest of her life. Case 5. Lois Nadean Smith, the woman who tortured and killed. On July 4, 1982, Independence Day, a day meant for celebration and family gatherings, 21-year-old Cindy Bailey made a decision that would cost her her life. She went to the home of Lois Nadean Smith in Gans, Oklahoma, in Sequoyah County, to pick up her son from his father, Lois's son Greg. What Cindy walked into was a nightmare that would end in one of the most brutal murders in Oklahoma history. Lois Nadean Smith was a mother herself, but on that 4th of July, any maternal instinct she might have possessed was completely absent. When Cindy Bailey arrived, Lois, along with her son Greg and possibly others, attacked the young woman in an assault so vicious that it would shock even hardened investigators who arrived at the scene. The attack on Cindy Bailey was not quick or merciful. According to court documents and testimony from the trial, Cindy was choked, beaten, and tortured over a period of time. Lois Smith was the primary aggressor. showing a level of cruelty and rage that seemed almost inhuman. Cindy was bound. She was strangled with such force that her throat was crushed, and according to some accounts, she was subjected to sexual violence and degradation before she finally died. But Lois wasn't finished even after Cindy was dead. In a final act of desecration, she shot Cindy's corpse multiple times, pumping bullets into the body of a woman who could no longer feel pain, but whose death apparently still wasn't enough to satisfy Lois's rage. The shooting was gratuitous, serving no purpose except to demonstrate the depths of Lois's depravity. After the murder, Lois and her accomplices attempted to dispose of Cindy's body. They wrapped her in plastic and hid her in a location where they hoped she wouldn't be found. But murder investigations have a way of unraveling cover-ups, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to piece together what had happened and who was responsible. The investigation revealed a horrifying scene. The physical evidence at Lois's home told the story of a prolonged, brutal attack. Blood spatter patterns, signs of struggle, and forensic evidence all pointed to the extreme violence that Cindy had endured in her final hours. Witnesses came forward with information about tensions between Lois and Cindy, primarily related to the child custody situation involving Lois's son and his relationship with Cindy. But what could possibly justify or explain the level of violence inflicted on Cindy Bailey? Custody disputes, no matter how bitter, don't typically end in torture and murder. What investigators uncovered was a woman, Lois Nadean Smith, who had a history of violent outbursts, poor impulse control, and a shocking lack of empathy for others. She wasn't just angry at Cindy. She wanted to make her suffer, to dominate her, to destroy her completely. Lois was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Given the brutality of the crime and the evidence of torture, prosecutors immediately sought the death penalty. This wasn't a crime of passion that lasted mere seconds. This was prolonged, intentional infliction of pain and terror on another human being, culminating in murder. If any case deserved the ultimate punishment, prosecutors argued, this was it. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Cindy Bailey's family had to sit through graphic testimony about her final hours, about the pain she endured, about the fear she must have felt as she realized she wasn't going to escape alive. They had to look at the woman who had tortured and killed their daughter, sister, and mother, and watch as she showed little to no remorse for her actions. Lois's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality was undeniable, and their client showed virtually no redeeming qualities that might persuade a jury to spare her life. They attempted to present mitigating factors: Lois's difficult upbringing, possible mental health issues, substance abuse problems, but none of it could explain away or excuse what she had done to Cindy Bailey. The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict that surprised no one: guilty of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, when the same jury had to decide whether Lois should live or die, they heard additional testimony about the aggravating factors of the crime. The torture, the sexual violence, the gratuitous shooting of the corpse, all of it painted a picture of someone who had committed one of the most heinous murders in Oklahoma history. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. Lois Nadean Smith was sentenced to die by lethal injection, becoming one of the few women on Oklahoma's death row. But unlike Brenda Andrew, whose case would come 2 decades later and who remains on death row today, Lois's time was measured in years, not decades. Lois spent nearly 2 decades on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center. During that time, she exhausted her appeals, with court after court upholding her conviction and sentence. The evidence was too strong, the crime too clear, the sentence too appropriate for any court to overturn it. Lois had destroyed Cindy Bailey's life in the most brutal way imaginable, and the state of Oklahoma was determined to exact the ultimate penalty. Life on death row is harsh, but for Lois, it may have been easier than what she inflicted on her victim. She had food, shelter, medical care, and the knowledge of when her end would come. Cindy Bailey had none of those mercies. She died in terror and agony, not knowing if each moment of torture would be her last, begging for her life from people who had no intention of showing her mercy. As Lois's execution date approached, there were the typical appeals for clemency, the last-ditch legal motions, and the protests from death penalty opponents who argue that the state should never take a life, regardless of the crime. But Oklahoma's governor and pardon board reviewed the case and found no reason to grant mercy. Lois had shown Cindy Bailey no mercy. Why should she receive what she refused to give? On December 4, 2001, Lois Nadean Smith was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was 51 years old and had spent nearly 20 years waiting to die. Her execution was notable for several reasons. She was the first woman executed in Oklahoma since 1903, nearly a full century. The rarity of executing women, even in death penalty states, underscores both the severity of her crime and the determination of Oklahoma's justice system to carry out the sentence. In her final moments, Lois was given the opportunity to make a final statement. Some condemned inmates use this moment to apologize, to express remorse, to seek forgiveness from their victims' families. Others maintain their innocence or rail against the injustice of their sentence. Lois reportedly made a brief statement, though the exact words have been disputed in various accounts. What is undisputed is that she showed little of the remorse or contrition that might have made her death seem less like justice and more like tragedy. The execution itself was carried out according to protocol. Lois was strapped to a gurney, intravenous lines were inserted, and a series of drugs were administered that would stop her heart and end her life. Unlike Cindy Bailey's death, which took time and involved immense suffering, Lois's death was relatively quick and, by design, painless. Some would say she got off easy. Others would argue that knowing your death is coming, waiting for it for 20 years, is its own form of torture. Cindy Bailey's family witnessed the execution. For them, it was a moment of closure, a final chapter in a horrific story that had dominated their lives for nearly 2 decades. Their loved one's killer would never hurt anyone again, would never breathe free air again, would never experience another sunrise. There is something in human nature that demands retribution for terrible wrongs, and Lois's execution satisfied that deep-seated need for justice. But executions, even of the most deserving, are complex moral events. Lois Nadean Smith was a mother. She had children who loved her despite her terrible actions. Those children lost their mother to the state, just as Cindy's child lost his mother to Lois's violence. The cycle of loss and pain radiates outward from violent crime, touching innocent lives in ways that can never be fully repaired. What drove Lois to commit such a brutal crime? Was it pure evil, a complete absence of conscience and empathy? Was it rage that spiraled out of control? Was it sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain? Psychologists who examined her found evidence of personality disorders and possible psychopathy, but diagnostic labels can only explain so much. At some point, we have to confront the reality that some people, for whatever combination of nature and nurture, are capable of monstrous acts. Lois Nadean Smith's case is particularly disturbing because of the torture element. Most murders, even first-degree murders, happen relatively quickly. A shooting takes seconds. Even strangulation, while more prolonged, typically takes only minutes. But Lois tortured Cindy over an extended period, suggesting that she derived some satisfaction from her victim's suffering. That level of cruelty places her in a category of offender that society has consistently judged worthy of the ultimate punishment. Today, Lois Nadean Smith is gone, executed over 2 decades ago. But her crime lives on in court records, in the memories of those who knew Cindy Bailey, and in the collective consciousness of Oklahoma as one of the state's most horrific murders. Her name is synonymous with cruelty, with the darkest aspects of human nature, and with the capacity for evil that exists in some individuals. Cindy Bailey was only 21 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her. She had a child who needed her. She had family who loved her. All of that was stolen by Lois Nadean Smith in an act of incomprehensible violence. That is why Lois earned her place on this list, why she deserved the death sentence she received, and why her name should be remembered alongside her victims, so that Cindy Bailey is never forgotten, and so that the world knows exactly what kind of person Lois Nadean Smith was. Case 6. Wanda Jean Allen, double killer who never learned. Some criminals commit a terrible crime, serve their time, and emerge from prison determined never to repeat their mistakes. They learn from their punishment, develop empathy, and become productive members of society. Wanda Jean Allen was not one of those people. Instead, She became the first woman executed in Oklahoma since Lois Nadean Smith, and her path to the death chamber was paved with not one, but two murders, proving that some people never learn, never change, and remain dangerous until their final breath. Wanda Jean Allen's first murder occurred in 1981. She shot and killed Pettis, a woman with whom she had been in a relationship. The details of that first murder are less well documented than her second, but what we know is chilling enough. During an argument, Wanda pulled out a gun and shot Detra, ending her life. It was a crime of passion, prosecutors said, driven by jealousy and rage. For this first murder, Wanda was convicted and sentenced to prison. But here's where the system failed in a way that would have tragic consequences. She didn't receive a life sentence. She was eventually released back into society, given another chance to live as a free woman. The assumption was that she had learned her lesson, that prison had rehabilitated her, that she wouldn't kill again. That assumption was dead wrong. In 1988, just a handful of years after her release, Wanda Jean Allen found herself in another volatile relationship, this time with a woman named Gloria Jean Leathers. Like her previous relationship with Detra Pettis, this relationship was marked by conflict, jealousy, and violence. Wanda had a temper, a possessive streak, and access to firearms, a combination that had already proven deadly once. On December 1, 1988, that deadly combination manifested again. Wanda and Gloria got into an argument outside the Oklahoma City police station. Yes, the police station itself, which speaks to the brazenness and poor impulse control that characterized Wanda's behavior. The argument escalated, and Wanda, repeating the pattern that had already cost one woman her life, pulled out a gun and shot Gloria Jean Leathers. Gloria was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. She died from her gunshot wound, becoming Wanda Jean Allen's second murder victim. This time, there would be no possibility of leniency, no chance of another release into society. Wanda had proven beyond any doubt that she was a danger to others, that she had learned nothing from her first conviction, and that she would continue to kill if given the opportunity. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They could point to Wanda's prior murder conviction, establishing a pattern of violent behavior. They had witnesses who saw the shooting happen right outside the police station. They had forensic evidence linking Wanda to the crime. And they had Wanda's own history as evidence that she was incapable of controlling her violent impulses. Wanda's defense team faced the same uphill battle that defenders of repeat violent offenders always face. How do you argue for mercy for someone who was already given mercy once and responded by killing again? They attempted to present mitigating evidence, including claims that Wanda had intellectual disabilities and had suffered abuse in her past. They argued that she deserved life in prison rather than death. But the prosecution countered effectively. They pointed out that whatever disabilities or challenges Wanda faced, they hadn't prevented her from obtaining weapons, from stalking her victims, from planning and executing murders. She was functional enough to be dangerous, and that danger had now manifested in two separate killings. If the justice system failed to protect society from Wanda Jean Allen, who knew how many more women might die, the jury agreed with the prosecution. They found Wanda guilty of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. The judge concurred, and Wanda Jean Allen was sentenced to die by lethal injection. She joined the small population of women on Oklahoma's death row, where she would spend the next 13 years exhausting her appeals and waiting for her execution date. During her time on death row, Wanda became something of a cause célèbre among death penalty opponents. Her case attracted attention from activists who argued that executing someone with intellectual disabilities was cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to her IQ scores, which fell in the range that some considered indicative of intellectual disability, and argued that the state should not execute her. The debate over Wanda's mental capacity became heated and highly publicized. Supporters argued that she didn't fully understand the wrongfulness of her actions due to cognitive limitations. Opponents countered that she understood enough to repeatedly obtain guns, to target specific individuals, and to pull the trigger, twice. The courts ultimately sided with those who believed her disabilities, whatever their extent, didn't preclude her from being held accountable for her crimes. Religious leaders, civil rights activists, and even some celebrities weighed in on Wanda's case. Reverend Jesse Jackson visited her on death row and pleaded with Oklahoma officials to spare her life. International human rights organizations sent letters urging clemency. The attention on her case was intense, with some framing it as a referendum on the death penalty itself, particularly the execution of women and people with disabilities. But lost in much of the activism and debate were the victims, Detra and Gloria Jean Leathers. These were real women with real lives, families who loved them, and futures that were stolen. Detra had already been dead for nearly 20 years by the time Wanda faced execution. Gloria had been dead for 13 years. Their families had waited a long time for justice, and many of them felt that Wanda's execution was not just deserved but necessary. Oklahoma's governor and pardon board reviewed Wanda's clemency petition carefully. They considered the arguments about her intellectual functioning, her troubled background, and the international attention on her case. But they also considered the fact that she had killed twice, that she had been given a second chance after her first murder and had squandered it by killing again, and that the jury and courts had consistently upheld her death sentence through numerous appeals. The clemency petition was denied. Wanda Jean Allen's execution would proceed as scheduled. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She was 41 years old. Her execution came just a little over a month after Lois Nadean Smith's execution, making it an unusual period in Oklahoma history, with two women executed in quick succession after nearly a century without executing any women at all. Wanda's final hours were spent with spiritual advisors and saying goodbye to the few visitors she was allowed. In her final statement, she reportedly expressed remorse for her actions and made peace with her impending death. Some saw this last-minute contrition as genuine, while others viewed it as too little, too late. Where was this remorse when she killed Gloria? Where was it when she repeated the same violent pattern that had already cost Detra her life? The execution itself proceeded without incident. Wanda was strapped to the gurney, the IVs were inserted, and the lethal drugs were administered. Within minutes, Wanda Jean Allen was dead, her heart stopped by the same state whose laws she had violated so egregiously. Outside the prison, both protesters and supporters of the execution held vigil, representing the deep divide in public opinion about capital punishment. Wanda Jean Allen's case raises difficult questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the purpose of the criminal justice system. After her first murder, she was given a second chance. The system believed, or at least hoped, that she could be rehabilitated, that prison would teach her to control her violent impulses, that she wouldn't kill again. That belief was tragically misplaced. If Wanda had been sentenced to life without parole for her first murder, Gloria Jean Leathers would likely still be alive today. That reality haunts discussions of her case. How do we balance the ideals of rehabilitation and second chances with the very real danger that some offenders pose to society? Wanda's case suggests that for some violent criminals, there are no second chances that don't put innocent lives at risk. The question of her intellectual capacity remains contentious. If she truly had significant cognitive impairments, should that have spared her from execution? Many would say yes, arguing that executing someone who doesn't fully comprehend the moral weight of their actions is fundamentally unjust. Others would counter that the severity and repetition of her crimes demonstrated enough understanding of right and wrong to hold her accountable. What cannot be disputed is that Wanda Jean Allen killed two women who had the misfortune of being in relationships with her. Both Detra and Gloria Jean Leathers deserved to live full lives. Both were cut down by gun violence at Wanda's hands. Both left behind grieving families who would never see them again. That is Wanda's legacy, and it's why she earned her place on this list of Oklahoma's most evil mothers and women. Today, more than 2 decades after her execution, Wanda Jean Allen's case is still cited in debates about the death penalty, particularly regarding the execution of women and individuals with intellectual disabilities. Her name appears in academic papers, legal briefs, and advocacy materials. But for the families of Detra and Gloria Jean Leathers, Wanda is remembered not as a symbol or a case study, but as the person who took their loved ones away and never showed genuine remorse until faced with her own mortality. Wanda Jean Allen will never kill again. She died on that gurney in 2001, her violent life brought to an end by the state's ultimate sanction. Whether you view her execution as justice served or a tragic failure of compassion, one thing remains clear. She had multiple chances to choose a different path, to control her rage, to value human life. She chose violence instead, twice, and paid the ultimate price for those choices. Case 7. Marilyn K. Plants, the woman who hired her lover to murder her husband. On a quiet August night in 1988, in Oklahoma City, Jim Plants arrived home from work tired and looking forward to rest. He had no idea that his wife, Marilyn, had been plotting his murder for weeks, or that this would be his last night alive. Waiting inside his home were his wife's teenage lover and another young man, both armed and ready to carry out Marilyn's deadly plan. What followed was a brutal murder that would eventually send Marilyn K. Plants to death row, where she would become the third and final woman executed by Oklahoma in the modern era. Marilyn K. Plants was a mother of 2, married to Jim Plants, and living what appeared to be a typical suburban life. But behind closed doors, Marilyn was deeply unhappy in her marriage and had begun an affair with a much younger man, 18-year-old Clifford Bryson. The affair wasn't just about sex. Marilyn became obsessed with Clifford, and the two began fantasizing about a life together without the complications of Marilyn's marriage. There was just one problem: Jim Plants. He stood in the way of Marilyn's happiness with Clifford. A divorce would mean splitting assets, possibly losing custody of the children, and certainly losing the financial security that came with her marriage. Marilyn wanted it all: her lover, her lifestyle, and her husband's life insurance money. So she began plotting murder. Marilyn recruited Clifford Bryson and his friend Clinton McKimball to kill Jim. The plan was straightforward but brutal. They would attack Jim in his own home, beat him unconscious, then stage a car accident to make it look like he had died in a crash. It was a murder-for-hire scheme, except instead of paying cash, Marilyn was trading on Clifford's infatuation with her and promising a future together once Jim was out of the picture. On August 26, 1988, the plan was put into motion. When Jim came home, he was ambushed by the 2 young men. They beat him savagely with baseball bats, striking him repeatedly in the head and body. Jim fought back as best he could, but he was outnumbered and taken by surprise. The attack was prolonged and brutal, leaving Jim barely alive but grievously injured. But the killers weren't finished. Following Marilyn's plan, they took Jim's unconscious body, placed him in his car, and drove to a remote location. There, they doused the car with gasoline and set it on fire with Jim still inside. Whether Jim was still alive when the fire started has been a matter of horrific speculation. The autopsy couldn't definitively determine whether he died from the beating or from the fire, but either way, his death was agonizing and terrifying. The next morning, Jim's burned body was discovered in the charred remains of his vehicle. Initially, investigators considered the possibility that it was simply a tragic accident, a car crash followed by a fire. But as they examined the evidence more closely, things didn't add up. The pattern of injuries on Jim's body suggested he'd been beaten before the fire. The location and circumstances of the crash seemed staged, and Marilyn's behavior raised red flags. Rather than showing the grief and devastation one would expect from a wife who had just lost her husband, Marilyn seemed oddly composed, almost relieved. When investigators questioned her about Jim's final day, her answers seemed rehearsed and lacking in genuine emotion. And when they began digging into her background, they discovered the affair with Clifford Bryson, a motive that tied everything together. Under interrogation, Clifford Bryson and Clinton McKimball eventually cracked. They confessed to the murder and implicated Marilyn as the mastermind who had orchestrated the entire plot. They described how she had persuaded them to kill Jim, how she had provided details about his schedule and when he would be home alone, and how she had promised Clifford that they could be together once Jim was dead. Marilyn was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, along with Bryson and McKimball. The evidence against all 3 was overwhelming. The confessions, the forensic evidence from Jim's body showing he'd been beaten, the staged nature of the car fire, all of it pointed to premeditated murder. But Marilyn was the one who had orchestrated it all, who had used her influence over a teenager to convince him to commit murder, who had coldly plotted her own husband's death while living under the same roof with him. The trial was emotionally charged. Jim Plantz's family testified about the man they had lost, a good father, a hard-working husband, someone who didn't deserve to die beaten and burned at the hands of his wife's teenage lover. They described the devastating impact on Jim's children, who lost their father and, in a sense, lost their mother too when she was revealed as his killer. Marilyn's defense team faced an uphill battle. They tried to suggest that she had been coerced or manipulated by Bryson, that she wasn't the true mastermind. But the evidence told a different story. Phone records showed Marilyn calling Bryson repeatedly in the days before the murder. Witnesses testified that Marilyn had talked about wanting Jim dead. And the very structure of the plot, using Jim's own car to stage an accident after killing him, showed a level of planning and forethought that could only have come from Marilyn. The prosecution painted Marilyn as a cold, calculating killer who was willing to sacrifice her husband's life for insurance money and to pursue her affair with a teenager. They noted the age difference between Marilyn and Clifford. She was a grown woman manipulating an 18-year-old boy, using his infatuation to turn him into a killer. They argued that of all the participants in this terrible crime, Marilyn was the most culpable because she had orchestrated it all. The jury agreed. They found Marilyn K. Plants guilty of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. Clifford Bryson and Clinton McKimball were also convicted, with Bryson receiving a life sentence and McKimball receiving various sentences for his role. But Marilyn, as the mastermind, received the harshest punishment, death by lethal injection. Marilyn spent over a decade on death row at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center. During that time, she exhausted her appeals, with court after court upholding her conviction and death sentence. She gave interviews from prison, some in which she maintained her innocence, and others in which she seemed to accept responsibility while minimizing her role. But regardless of what she said, the facts remained unchanged. She had plotted and orchestrated her husband's murder. As her execution date approached in 2001, there were the usual calls for clemency. Some argued that Marilyn should be spared because she didn't personally commit the violence. She hadn't swung the baseball bat or lit the match. But Oklahoma's law is clear. Those who hire others to commit murder are just as culpable as those who carry it out. In fact, one could argue that hiring killers is even more calculated and cold-blooded than committing murder in a moment of passion. Jim and Marilyn's children had to grapple with an impossible situation. Their father was dead, murdered, and their mother was his killer. Some of them advocated for sparing Marilyn's life, not because they believed she was innocent, but because they didn't want to lose both parents. Others felt that justice demanded her execution. The family was torn apart by Marilyn's crime in ways that extended far beyond Jim's death. On May 1, 2001, Marilyn K. Plants was executed by lethal injection. She was 40 years old and had spent 13 years on death row. Her execution came just months after Wanda Jean Allen's and Lois Nadean Smith's, completing a trio of women executed by Oklahoma in quick succession after nearly a century without executing any women. In her final statement, Marilyn reportedly apologized to her family and to Jim's family. She expressed remorse for her actions and asked for forgiveness. Some viewed this as genuine contrition finally emerging after years of denial. Others saw it as too little, too late, a deathbed conversion that didn't undo the terrible harm she had caused. The execution was carried out without incident. Marilyn was pronounced dead minutes after the lethal drugs were administered, bringing to an end a life that had been defined by betrayal, murder, and ultimately justice. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters demonstrated against the death penalty, while victims' rights advocates stood in support of the execution. Marilyn K. Plants's case is a textbook example of murder for hire and the deadly combination of greed, lust, and moral bankruptcy. She had options. She could have divorced Jim, walked away from her marriage, started a new life with or without Clifford Bryson. Instead, she chose murder because it seemed like the easier path, the path that let her have everything she wanted without sacrifice. But murder is never the easy path. It destroyed Jim's life, traumatized their children, sent Clifford Bryson to prison for life, and ultimately cost Marilyn her own life. She spent 13 years on death row knowing that every day brought her closer to execution, living with the knowledge of what she had done and what it had cost her. Some might say those 13 years were punishment enough, but Oklahoma law said otherwise. Jim Plants never got to see his children grow up. He never got to retire, to meet his grandchildren, to enjoy the fruits of his years of hard work. He died in terror and pain, beaten by strangers, and burned alive, all because the woman he had married and trusted decided he was worth more dead than alive. That is Marilyn's legacy, the destruction of a family, the betrayal of trust, and the cold calculation that led to murder. Today, over 2 decades after her execution, Marilyn K. Plants is remembered as one of the few women executed in Oklahoma's modern era. Her case is studied in criminal justice courses, cited in legal briefs about death penalty jurisprudence, and referenced in discussions about murder-for-hire schemes. But for Jim's family, she is simply the woman who took their loved one away and who paid the ultimate price for that terrible choice. Marilyn K. Plants will never kill again, will never manipulate another vulnerable young person into committing murder, will never trade another human life for personal gain. She died on that gurney in 2001, her crimes finally answered with the justice system's ultimate sanction. Whether you view her execution as righteous justice or state-sanctioned killing, one thing is certain. She orchestrated a terrible crime, and she paid for it with her life, just as Jim Plants paid for her greed and betrayal with his. 7 women, 7 mothers, 7 stories of unthinkable evil committed against children and husbands who should have been safe, protected, loved. These cases from Oklahoma represent some of the most disturbing examples of maternal and spousal violence in modern American history. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the capacity for cruelty that can exist even in those we trust most. Summer Rust, who suffocated her own 3-year-old daughter and tried to stage it as an accident. Toni Ingram, who starved her adopted 9-year-old son to death while feeding her biological children normally. Alysia Adams, who beat 4-year-old Athena Brownfield to death and buried her in a neighbor's yard. These maternal murderers shattered the most fundamental bond in human society, the bond between mother and child. Brenda Andrew, who orchestrated her husband's murder for insurance money and to pursue her affair, who now sits alone on death row as Oklahoma's only female death row inmate. Lois Nadean Smith, who tortured and murdered Cindy Bailey in an act of cruelty so extreme she became the first woman executed in Oklahoma in nearly a century. Wanda Jean Allen, who killed twice, proving that some people never learn and remain dangerous until their final breath. Marilyn K. Plants, who hired teenagers to beat and burn her husband to death so she could collect his insurance and be with her young lover. What do these 7 women have in common? They all chose violence over virtue. They all valued their own desires, whether money, freedom, or revenge, over human life. They all had opportunities to make different choices, to walk away, to seek help, to do literally anything other than murder. And they all failed that basic moral test that most humans pass without even thinking about it. The question that haunts all these cases is why. Why does a mother kill her child? Why does a wife murder her husband? Psychologists offer various explanations: personality disorders, psychopathy, abuse histories, mental illness. But explanations are not excuses. Millions of people experience difficult childhoods, mental health challenges, and troubled relationships without ever harming anyone. These 7 women made choices, conscious decisions to destroy lives, and they must be held accountable for those choices. The victims in these cases deserve to be remembered. 3-year-old Tegan Rust, who should be a teenager now, maybe playing sports or learning to drive. The 9-year-old boy starved by Toni Ingram, whose name we may not know but whose suffering we can never forget. 4-year-old Athena Brownfield, whose bright future was stolen before it really began. Rob Andrew, Keith Bryan, and Jim Plants, husbands and fathers who died at the hands of the women who vowed to love them. Cindy Bailey and Gloria Jean Leathers, women murdered by Lois Nadean Smith and Wanda Jean Allen in acts of senseless violence. These victims had families who loved them, futures that were stolen, potential that will never be realized. When we focus too much on the perpetrators, their psychology, their motivations, their backgrounds, we risk losing sight of the real tragedy, which is the loss of innocent life. Every person killed in these cases mattered. They had value, dignity, and rights that were violated in the most fundamental way. The Oklahoma criminal justice system responded to these crimes with appropriate severity. Summer Rust, Brenda Andrew, Toni Ingram, and Alysia Adams will never leave prison alive. They will grow old behind bars, spending decades reflecting on their crimes, or, in some cases, continuing to deny responsibility. Lois Nadine Smith, Wanda Jean Allen, and Marilyn K. Plants were executed, paying for their crimes with their own lives in a stark demonstration of society's ultimate punishment for ultimate crimes. Whether you support or oppose the death penalty, these cases test the limits of our moral reasoning. If we can't execute someone who tortured a young woman to death, who can we execute? If a mother who deliberately starves her child doesn't deserve life in prison, who does? These are not easy questions, but they're questions we must grapple with as a society that values both justice and mercy. For the families left behind, there is no closure, no moment when the pain disappears. Victims' families carry their grief forever, marking birthdays that will never be celebrated, holidays that will never be the same, futures that were stolen. Some find solace in the justice system's response, in guilty verdicts, life sentences, and executions. Others find that no punishment can truly balance the scales or bring back their loved ones. The children who survive these cases bear perhaps the heaviest burden. Summer Rust's surviving children, Brenda Andrew's kids, Jim Plantz's sons and daughters. They all lost parents to prison or death. They all carry the knowledge of what their mothers did, and they all face the challenge of building lives despite the trauma of their childhoods. These children are innocent victims too, and their stories of resilience and survival deserve recognition. As we close this documentary, we want to emphasize that these 7 cases, while shocking, are not representative of mothers or women in general. The vast majority of mothers would sooner die than harm their children. Most wives would never dream of murdering their husbands. These 7 women are outliers, aberrations, examples of the darkness that exists in a tiny fraction of the population. But they are real. Their crimes happened. Their victims died. And their stories serve as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It can live in suburban homes, attend church on Sundays, smile at neighbors, and appear completely normal right up until the moment it strikes. That is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all, that the capacity for terrible evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence or child abuse, please reach out for help. There are resources available, hotlines you can call, shelters that can provide safety. Violence is never the answer, whether you're the victim or someone who feels pushed to the breaking point. There are always alternatives to violence, always paths that don't lead to prison or death. To our viewers, thank you for watching this difficult documentary. We know these stories are hard to hear, disturbing to contemplate, and emotionally draining. But we believe it's important to document these cases, to remember the victims, and to understand the depths of human depravity so that we can work to prevent such tragedies in the future. If you found this documentary informative and important, please hit that subscribe button for Cold Case Time. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on these cases. We read every comment and value your input. And if you appreciate the deep research and respectful treatment we bring to these difficult topics, give this video a like. These 7 women, Summer Rust, Toni Ingram, Alysia Adams, Brenda Andrew, Lois Nadine Smith, Wanda Jean Allen, and Marilyn K. Plants, will never see freedom again. Some are dead, executed by the state. Others will die in prison, whether from old age or illness. But their names and crimes will live on in Oklahoma history as examples of maternal and spousal evil in its most extreme forms. May the victims rest in peace. May the survivors find healing. And may these stories serve as a warning about the darkness that can lurk even in those we should be able to trust most. This has been Cold Case Time. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember that justice, though sometimes delayed, does eventually arrive for even the most heinous crimes.